Hi, my name's Gaston Liang, and this is a pre-recorded talk for the Australasian Mathematical Psychology Conference 2021. I'm going to be presenting some work today on how people use decision aids and whether this changes based on whether the aid is automatically provided or manually sought out. This is work from my PhD that I've been doing with my supervisors Ben Newell and Chris Donkin. So what is a decision aid? So we're defining decision aids pretty broadly, but we're calling them any tool that gives people a recommendation to help them make a choice. So a manual decision aid might be a visual search algorithm that a radiologist can voluntarily choose to check a patient scan against. The automatic version of this might be the same algorithm that just runs in the background constantly, and that'll flag concerns with the radiologist whenever they see one come up on a scan. The idea with this talk is that I want to look at this automatic and manual distinction, and in particular, how do time costs matter for the automatic decision aid? I want to discuss these findings within the context of the timed racing diffusion model, so I'll be referring to it throughout the talk. To introduce you to the general task, participants are given a standard dot motion task where they can access an algorithm to help give them a little bit of extra help. So the algorithm is this green box that sits above the screen. And whenever participants press a key, it'll take a second to load, and then an arrow will pop up so they can help recommend a direction for them to choose. Now, amongst these key features with the decision aid, we also tell participants that it will give you the correct answer on 70% of occasions. And what that means is that 30% of the time, the algorithm will in fact recommend the wrong direction. And we leave it up to participants to decide when they want to ignore it. We've chosen this 70% figure because it bisects the levels of performance on easier and harder stimuli in our task. So as you can see in training, participants typically perform quite well at the easier task, but then struggle a bit with the harder version. And so we put the algorithm at 70% so that participants can decide when and if they want to consult it. Now, one reason why you might ask for the algorithm's help is when you know that you're basically guessing. And this could be somewhat of a strategic choice. You might have a vague idea, but you might decide that you're not doing as well as you could be if you were to ask the algorithm and rely on its 70% guess. And so it might not be entirely necessary to use the algorithm on the easier trials, but it might make sense to ask for the algorithm on every single harder trial if you're going to be performing worse than 70%. How often participants actually use the algorithm, we can see that for the most part, at least with the easier stimuli, they don't use it all that often, which makes sense given that they're actually quite good at this task. But when you consider the harder stimuli and how most people performed worse than 70%, well, you can see that the majority of participants actually only use it about less than half the time. And so this is sort of underutilizing a tool that might be useful for you in this sort of task. So this led us to ask, why don't participants use it more often? So one reason why people might be asking for the algorithm is just to help them when the trial itself is taking too long. So we could look at reaction time data for when participants don't request the algorithm and when they do request it to get a sense of what's going on. So the long and short of it is that participants take longer to respond to the harder images at about 2 seconds compared to 1 second for the easier stimuli. But when they ask for the algorithm, this time really stacks up. So it takes 2 seconds for them to decide whether or not they need the help. And then after which, when they ask for it, it takes a second for the algorithm to load, then about another second for the arrow to pop up and for them to respond. So all up, this takes about 4.5 seconds over what would be 2 seconds if you don't make an intuitive guess. So we're curious, how does this fit within the framework of the timed racing diffusion model? In this model, participants are presented with the stimulus, and then this sets off 2 racing accumulators. One that's gathering evidence for a particular direction, and one that's just tracking the general passage of time. So for the easier stimuli, it might be easy to determine the direction of the dots. And so the evidence accumulator might win out and participants make a certain response. But for the harder stimuli, it might take a bit longer. And so the timer accumulator might then end up winning. And what participants could do in the standard timed racing diffusion model is hurry up and just make a guess. And so they choose randomly between them. One thing we're trying to expand upon in our experiments is whether participants might then seek out the recommendation to help inform that guess. So they might then, at the end of that, check what the algorithm says, and then guess according to the arrow that pops out. Now, this is where the manual order distinction comes back in that in this data that we've just been talking about, participants needed to manually request it and press a key at the end of that timer process. What we want to see is whether changing this into an automatic process where the algorithm's arrow loads at the start of the trial alongside the stimulus makes an impact as to how often people will recruit that extra partial information that they get out of the arrow. So this brings us to the experiment with an automatically loading decision aid. And we use the reaction time data from the previous manual experiment to inform how long we should set the loading time of the algorithm. And so we looked at how long it took participants to respond on their own, and then how long it took them to respond with the decision aid to figure out these loading times. We settled on 1.8 seconds because this closely mirrors when participants would ask for extra information in the manual version of the task. It also discourages waiting for the algorithm on the easier trials because this is almost twice as long as it would take for people to respond on their own. We also set the longer time to 2.8 seconds to see if participants would wait this extra amount of time for the recommendation. And that all up, in both of these conditions, the algorithm appears much quicker than in the manual version of this task, which took about 4.5 seconds to use up the information. And so in the experiment, we gave people easier and harder images that were intermixed in the block. We also gave them feedback at the end of each block to tell them how well they were doing on the easier tasks separately from the harder images. And we had a between subjects manipulation of loading time. So we're going to compare the 1.8 condition to the 2.8 condition in seconds, sorry. And so participants are now given the choice about whether or not they want to respond first and preempt the loading of the decision aid, or do they want to wait and withhold their response so they can use the partial information that might actually help them. This is all with the 70% algorithm that may or may not be helpful depending on the stimulus in question. So we can look at how often participants let the algorithm load in full, and we'll start with the data for the easier stimuli. It looks like far more participants waited for the algorithm in the 1.8 condition compared to the 2.8 condition. And this is even though it was quicker just to make a response on their own. So it's unlikely in this scenario that the timing accumulator would win out. And so one thing here is that participants might actually be withholding their own responses, given the knowledge that there's going to be an arrow that'll pop up, and so they can check their answer against the arrow whenever it does. So turning to the harder images now, most participants waited for the algorithm to load on most trials, and perhaps a little bit more so in the 1.8 second condition than the 2.8 condition. Now, one question is whether this lower time cost encourages people to use the information more effectively, because it would be both quicker for them and better in terms of performance to just quickly agree with the arrow when it came out. Now, when we look at the agreement percentages, it seems like people agree most of the time, but it's worth remembering that participants were generally better at the task than the algorithm was, at least for the easier trials. And so disagreement here is often participants looking at the arrow and thinking, hang on, that's not quite right. I've got to overrule this and go with my own gut judgment. But for the harder images, participants really can't tell the direction apart on their own. And remember that from the training data, typically they're performing at about chance levels. And so disagreeing with the algorithm here is actually harming their overall performance. And in fact, if you're agreeing with the algorithm that's 70% correct only 75% of the time, they're not doing much better than chance performance on their own. The RT data, in fact, helps tease apart slightly different response types here. And so just looking at the group level data first for the 1.8 second condition, the intercept shows when the arrow will load. And so response times before the arrow loads are in tan, and then after the algorithm loads, those RTs are shown in green, and these are all in seconds. So you can see that the bulk of the responses for the easier trials are tan colored and before the algorithm loads. But there is a peak just immediately afterwards for people who are sort of just double checking their responses. When we look at the harder trials, this peak is about a second after the algorithm loads in the green. But then there's also quite a fat tail suggesting that people are actually spending quite a long time trying to check these answers. Now, we can try find these individual response patterns amongst the group data. So I've just picked out a few sort of demonstrating participants. So this participant here is exhibiting the sort of maximization behavior that we've been looking for. The bulk of their easier responses are made without the algorithm, and so they're tan colored. And then for the harder trials, the bulk of their responses are with the algorithm and relatively quickly. And so to speak, they're exploiting that knowledge the algorithm will outperform them. And so there's another kind of participant that's doing something similar in that they're relying on the algorithm extensively, but then they're also laboring, trying to double check the arrow in the trials after the, in this time after the algorithm is loaded. And so they end up taking substantially longer on a large number of trials because they're trying to double check every single arrow against what they see in front of them. So for these participants, we expect the timing accumulator parameters to be most informative, mostly because these participants have access to both their own evidence and the arrow for most of their trials. And just to illustrate, there's a group of participants that rarely use the algorithm, and we're calling rarely users less than 15% of the time, but here's a participant that never touched it at all. And so when we compare these numbers across the different groups, we can see that there's a substantial difference in the number of people who are doing the double checking behavior between the two loading time conditions. And this is sort of most evident in the tails and the peaks of the green bars. So the green bars show when the algorithm has loaded. And so in the 2.8 condition, the peak is higher and also the tails are far thinner. So it's looking like that waiting for the 2.8 seconds kind of imposes an upfront cost on waiting for it. And so people are more committed to what the arrow says afterwards once it's appeared. So scoping out, there seems to be a mixture of responses to how people use the partial information in the algorithm. And some of these patterns, like the double checking method, resembles like a guess after deciding that the trial's taken too long. So like after the timing accumulator wins out, you might see more guessing in that sort of condition. But we also have people who are withholding their responses, seemingly for the easier stimuli when they seem to know the answer. So one question this begs is that information in this task is discontinuous. And so how does that affect the timer accumulator? We can see that this could affect people's behavior in the sense that the evidence accumulator in the task might be separated into sort of like two stages, where you have an initial stage of can I see the direction in the stimulus on my own, and then a second stage where you're trying to test, can I see the arrow's direction, or can I see the dots that it's referring to? And it's interesting to think maybe the timer accumulator stays the same over this whole period of time, but how does it adjust for these two bits of information? Some open questions that remain is that that longer loading times seem to encourage more agreement with the arrow. So it's sort of like a sunk cost thing. People are sure of their own uncertainty, perhaps, that they don't know the answer by that stage, and so they'll strategically guess at the end of it. But one question is, would this affect the timing accumulator? So in that sense, people might set a harsh criterion for responding quickly, which is strategic, but then does that get interpreted as a low tolerance for waiting longer, or they don't want to wait? And finally, it's just strange that knowing that the arrow will appear seems to slow people down on the easier trials. And so a question I keep coming back to is, why do people wait for this unreliable information? And so one possibility is that they're trying to verify the 70% information for themselves and not believe the experimenter. But there's still a lot of trials where you're wasting a lot of time overall. So these are just things I'm pondering over. And thank you.